Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with me, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Hello. Good evening in the UK, but not good evening in Latin America. From Colombia, my guest is coming. And I mistakenly said Colombia originally when I was trying to sort this out. And of course, that's an entirely different place. We're talking about Colombia in America and Latin America. Please excuse some of the background sounds. We're trying to go for authentic here, and we're trying to go for like urban, really rich environmental sounds to make you feel all part of it. Anyway, welcome to ML Clark, who is a colleague of mine and writer here at OnlySky, where I write and where you might have caught some of my work. ML, welcome to the show here. Would you like to introduce yourself to the people who might not know you, and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sounds great. I'm delighted to be here, a longtime follower of the channel. So it's interesting to be on the other side. I am, of course, ML Clark is how most people will probably know me from OnlySky and online. I am a writer of humanist essays as well as a writer of speculative fictions. I'm a secular humanist. That's much more important to me than the label atheist, and we'll go into that, of course. And I am Canadian, which is a very strange thing to find in Colombia, but so it goes. It is funny, I know you caught yourself in terms of saying Colombia is not in America, but if you're in Colombia, they will tell you that Colombia and South America is still the Americas and that the United States should not have taken America for itself. It's a very contentious topic. So yes, naturally, Colombia is technically in America.
Damn straight. And you tell them. Yeah, it's those North Americans. They rule the world, don't they? Do you know what? We're just starting to get towards the better part of spring onto summer, and there's a fly in here. I haven't seen a fly for like 9 months, and now it's buzzing around. So sorry about that. So check that siren out. As I said,
yes.
ML is in the midst of it all. So
yes.
where are you living exactly at the moment?
I live in Medellin, a little bit to the top. And I'm going to say for folks who are in the United States, you might have heard the name Medellin because of Mexican Spanish. Mexican Spanish will use a Y sound for the double L. But if you live in Colombia, it's Medellin is the way to pronounce it properly. And then so a little bit north of the main city proper, we have the highway. And so I have all the beautiful highway sounds, plus a military helicopters just flying past my window too. So it's always interesting out here.
This is how we roll. So you are self-identified there as a secular humanist.
Yes.
What does secular humanist mean to you, and why is that more important?
Yeah, that's the but. Go ahead.
I was going to say, why is that more important than atheist?
Terrifically so. Okay, so the important thing about secular humanism is that there are two words there. So the first word, secular, we all understand in terms of involving a space outside of religion. But the fact that I use it and not just humanism is also a kind of way of including people into the broader humanist spectrum. Because what humanism is at its base and how it differentiates itself from basic atheism is that humanism is a positive philosophy. It's a philosophy of action. Atheism only addresses what I do not believe in. But when we talk about humanism, we are talking about a philosophy of action. There's the helicopter. I don't know if you can hear that one now. That's the military helicopter in the background. Great. Philosophy of action that focuses on optimizing and maximizing human agency using the most comprehensive data available to us. So it's very much empirically forward. It's very much thinking about all of the data and knowledge that we have as humans to inform better public policy. So as you can see, even just talking about it, there's a huge difference in terms of what is covered under the framework of atheism. And unfortunately, in our cultures, when we talk about atheism, there's also often an implied semiotic meaning that's not accurate. Many people will use the word atheist to imply many more things than just the basic belief or the lack of belief in God. And they will assume being atheist automatically makes them empirical thinkers or critical thinkers or rationalists. And that's not at all true that any of those things are intrinsic to the definition of atheism. And so we can fall into, we can lull ourselves into a false sense of security that we are in fact critical thinkers, we are in fact more superior in our thinking, but one does not actually need much to be atheist. You can be much more, but the basic definition requires you to leap in towards broader philosophies and to think about how you would define yourself, which is where secular humanism comes in.
Yeah, so this is something that you see both from external to atheism and internal, which is, when you say the word, oh, I'm an atheist,
Yes.
For an outsider, say for a Christian, that they think, right, liberal, person that thinks they're really rational, that thinks they're using all this empirical data and blah 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 on all these things, and then people who are atheists themselves also add those things on naturally, because those very often happen to be things they also do as well. But it's not that those things are, as you say, intrinsic to atheism, but they are things that often correlate with atheism, and that's that's important to distinguish.
Yes.
So therefore, secular humanism does a lot more work than atheism.
Absolutely.
So do you, when you speak to people, and I don't know how much you interact sort of locally, whether all your friends in Colombia are, immigrant expat friends, or whether they are, whether you mix a lot with the locals, but when you talk to people back in Canada or in America, or across the world, when you say secular humanist, do people know what you mean generally?
Yes, so two things. I do not talk to expats here. I spend almost all of my time completely immersed with the locals. I often find there's a very different experience of the country because of that. And if I'm talking to the locals, humanism is actually much better understood. And that's something that a lot of North Americans would not expect, because there are also a lot of embedded ideas about Latin America in general. And often, we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit more. We often get so comfortable in our discourse and so consumed in our discourse in North America that we forget there are other discourses in the world. And so it can shock us and surprise us when there are different ways of doing things like politics. So we're just in the middle of an election cycle here in Colombia. They have a model that's somewhat based on the United States model, but they do have a secondary runoff for presidents, and that particular level is coming up at the end of May. They had their first runoff to choose the main candidates for the second part. And in the run-up, you had actually a humanist running for office prominently.
So was that the guy that had that famous viral video?
Oh, I don't know. I viral here for sure, but I'm not sure what's viral somewhere else.
I saw it on, is either Seth Meyers or something else.
I don't know. This is the fellow. Let me see if I can read it. So this is Alejandro Gaviria. He's not the only humanist here, but humanism is well entrenched and established as one possible way of talking about the world. This was an older one of his books. I have got two of his books with me right now. The other one here, you can see, this one came out during the run-up to the election in defense of humanism. And the funny thing, there's two parts of this. One is that this culture is not as antagonistic towards intellect and academia being a part of regular election cycles. And that's different than the United States, obviously.
Yeah, that's really different, and interesting difference as well. Possibly
huge.
Something that isn't often explicitly talked about.
No.
That's an interesting point.
And not just in the United States, though. So I will also wrap the knuckles of my fellow Canadians, because we did once have a professor running for liberal office, Michael Ignatieff, but he came up through political science. He was within the wheelhouse that one would ostensibly think, well, if anybody in academia is going to be running for office, this seems like a pretty decent background. But he was also mocked and decried with the same kind of talking points that are anti-intellectual in the United States that one often finds in U.S. election cycles. But there is a tremendous respect.
It reminds me, me, there's a politician, a conservative politician called Michael Gove in the UK. And at the point when we were having the big Brexit debates, and people were bringing into play like evidence and argument, rational, evidentially based arguments. He was saying he said famously, we've had enough of experts. And it's like, no, we haven't.
No, we have not. We have not. Absolutely. So that comes to the second point. I want to call attention to this one. This one was published in the middle of COVID. Another end of the world is possible. And it's a reflection from his time in government, working within the Ministry of Health and certain other policy portfolios that were related to COVID response. And very importantly here is that he's comparing the current situation to the writings of Aldous Huxley. And he felt comfortable doing that. Felt comfortable integrating literary history with philosophy, with public debate right now, because that is also a common mode of talking among certain circles of politicians here without any kind of recrimination. And I'm sure that in Europe, you've encountered that quite often as well. There are many literary cultures that feel much more comfortable just bringing in history, bringing in philosophy, bringing in those references. But in North America, It's certainly in my lifetime, probably a little bit before my lifetime too, there has been an acculturated response to anything intellectual as ivory tower, elitist, not of the common man, and it is completely impoverished debate. But the worst part is most folks in Canada and the United States just assume, well, what else is there? This has got to be the best there is. That's why it's really important to look at other parts of the world and to see how their own discourses move, because oftentimes we can see by clear example that there are other ways of being, and then it opens up all kinds of possibilities.
This is the whole idea behind having multiple voices,
Yes.
giving a much, we're big on that at OnlySky. It's not just about, and I don't want to be all tropish here, but it's not just about, heterosexual white men like me. It's about far greater diversity, because with that, obviously it's far more representative, but also people's ideas of who they are and where they fit in the world are much more accurate when you have a much greater understanding of the other voices out there, of the world out there, right? And in order to understand the world out there, you need voices of the world out there to help you along the way. And so there's so many reasons why multiple voices are really, really important.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, Jonathan, you also saw this during the time that the United States was struggling over the possibility of having single-payer health care and the idea of universal health care, state provided. Canada was watching, UK was watching, the rest of the world was watching, saying maybe, hopefully, finally. And we would hear all these arguments about death panels and about killing granny. And it was this microcosm that was completely cut out from the many excellent examples in the United States, in the UK, and the rest of the world that they could have looked to see, do we have death panels? Are we killing granny? But it never happened because people get caught in their info silo. And it happens even in a global age, even in a digital age. We still manage to be so trapped in our own particular mode of discourse that we don't even think about the possibilities.
Blame the algorithms, yeah. Just on and rightly so.
The billionaires behind the algorithms, let's put it that way.
Well, so what the great what's the Netflix documentary, the social dilemma. Social Dilemma, which is an absolute must-watch on Netflix. It's a game changer, and just the very, very end, like the last couple of minutes on there, are so key. Which is all the experts who are contributing to the show, who are either CEOs or ex this or ex that of Twitter and this and that. All of them say, I don't allow my kids on social media. I don't allow, it's like all these billionaires who have the they have the knowledge. They're like, I don't let anyone near it because those algorithms are dangerous, man.
Oh, absolutely. I would also recommend Cory Doctorow, who's a perfect example of someone who blends the world of speculative fiction and extreme activism, quite necessary activism in the digital age, because he talks a lot about anti-monopolies, and he looks a lot at the kind of case law that has built the system that has allowed for so many of these digital networks to completely destroy any kind of social discourse. Wonderful person to follow, and his science fiction correlates strongly with that because he provides ways of imagining a way out of this situation. Can
you say his name again? Sorry.
Cory Doctorow, and the Doctorow has a W at the end.
Okay, so Cory Doctorow, and we'll come on to fiction a little bit later. That's somewhere we're going to go. I know you're going to get excited by this comment, which is boosting the interview in COSO. So
please do.
For those who don't know COSO, so ML has been big on finding alternatives for Twitter in at the time when old Elon Musk as the free speech absolutist he is, has decided to take over. And Counter Social is an alternative to Twitter that a lot of people are banging on about at the moment, and you're a big advocate of.
Well, actually, in the recent article, I didn't call it. I said it's not the new Twitter. It is absolutely something different, better, and it has been around before. This is quite interesting, too, because other alternatives did exist. And we'll talk about that again when we talk about the science and imagining better futures. Often we already have the technology. So what the people in Counter Social have is a community that they've carefully cultivated. And with Elon Musk, we now have this moment where we can have groundswell to start to port over and to use the technology and the aesthetics and the values that these folks have already been cultivating. But it's almost, when we talk about the idea of finding or discovering, it's almost like Christopher Columbus landing and saying, I discovered America, and all of the Amerindians are thinking, what are we, chopped liver? But the Counter Social has built something special. Exactly. And now there's an opportunity to really move the discourse towards helping them continue to grow what they're trying to do already.
Excellent. And this I love conversations like this because we are completely going to go down rabbit holes because already we could have gone down like five.
Totally.
And these rabbit holes we're going to return to. I just want to, before I begin, I'm going to do some spamming here. So I wrote I edited a book a couple of years ago when I used to write at Patheos, non-religious. And I produced an anthology of writers from Patheos. This is still such a good book to get. So it's called Not Seeing God, Atheism in the 21st Century. Which is where you can build secular humanism. We talk about stuff like that. But there's a chapter in here by Luciano Gonzalez, who I previously interviewed, who's now joined us at OnlySky. The importance of visibility when not seeing God in Latin America. So the reason I just wanted to say that was a really interesting chapter on humanism and atheism in Latin America and giving that side of things. What is, going back to you, what are, and sorry, so I just saw Alan Hensey there is giving you some props. So
they're chatting about that particular piece because they understand that it was a fairly written piece, and that's really important. We don't want pieces that are either completely blowing it out of proportion. It is a work in progress because it has always been working for a very small set of people, a small community. And now, if we all hop over, it's going to have an adjustment period to be able to manage the influx of new folks and to continue to sustain itself and healthily grow in all the manners that it is managed for 4 years. And folks coming into that service need to recognize that. Twitter, unfortunately, and Facebook and many other neoliberal projects have built into us a kind of passivity. We expect, well, we're going to be giving up, our rights to anything. We're going to become complicit in genocide inciting social media platforms, but at least they're going to do everything for us. That's not the case with counter-social. You do actually need to choose to be a participant in change. And so that's really important.
That's a really interesting, and this is a rabbit hole we could. Well, okay, just for those who don't know, you can opt into just really briefly explain the whole principle of counter-social there in how you opt into different spaces.
Yes. So the way that things work, it's usually good to use contrast from what people know. And Twitter and Facebook have algorithms that shape your feed for you. And never for your own benefit. It's for advertisers' benefit. It's for the people who already have lots of followers. So it builds up a kind of popularity hierarchy. But the way counter-social works is that when you see posts just in chronological order, and there's no algorithm saying, oh, this person has 1,000 people, so they're a little bit more likely to end up on your feed. This person only has 2 followers, so you're never going to see them. You get to see the whole community, which means you get to choose which parts you'd like to continue seeing. And so you're able to create other columns based on your interests, hashtags. We'll decide, for instance, I have hashtags for writing community. And so I pin those up, and then I just see what other folks who are interested in those themes want to talk about those themes. I can choose where I want to pour my attention. And because there are no ads, it's not funded by advertisers, it's funded by the actual users. So there's no incentive whatsoever to push content in a particular direction. There's no flash of this is what's trending, this hashtag is trending, this particular name is trending. You have to find out right now. You get to choose your experience. And I already got to see how this played out for the Roe v. Wade, because on Twitter, you get thrust into a variety of conversations immediately. But on counter-social, there was an immediate mitigation because it also has a content warning feature. So you can say, okay, I'm going to talk about politics under this. If you don't want to read it, you don't have to. So everything about the site allows people to curate their own experience and decide how much they want to take in. And it creates a very different experience because of that.
Interesting. I mean, this is just another thing I'm going to have to get into and lose more of my life to. So thanks for that. So going back to yourself, you are from the United States of Canada, and
for a moment I was going to fight you. It was like
I can see that was going to be at you.
No, there's the joke about the 51st state, but good heavens, no.
Although that's often said about Britain as well, and there's a great song by there's a great song by the New Model Army called 51st State, which is an amazingly cool song. But anyway,
I'll look that up.
Me going off on one. So you're from Canada. How did your youth, form who you are today and your ideas about reality? How did you become a secular humanist?
Great. So that's a huge question. We're only going to cut to a couple slices of my background. The most important part is that I grew up in a free-thinking household, which is a little bit different than just an atheist household. Many atheist households are not free-thinking households. Many times I will see folks who are very excited to raise up their children as atheists, and they don't realize they're often repeating exactly the same mistakes that you'll find in a lot of homes of religious families, because small children will always replicate, they'll always want to emulate, they'll always want to please their parents. To teach a child to be a critical thinker is something else entirely. So there are free-thinking atheist homes, but not every atheist home is free-thinking. I was very fortunate to be born into a free-thinking home where I vaguely understood my parents' beliefs, but more importantly, they cultivated a very strong, voracious appetite for reading, obviously, and they never had anxiety about me wanting to learn about the world. Second part of my childhood that ties into this is that I happened to grow up in Toronto. And Toronto is just, it's the world exists in that city. You grow out in the course of my lifetime, I think it tipped over the total. More people live in Toronto who were not born in Canada than people who were born in Canada. At some point in my lifetime, those numbers switched over. So tremendous richness, which meant that I had, there was a Korean Presbyterian church down the street. There was a West Indies Pentecostal church, youth group with one of my evangelical high school friends. And of course, you had access to everyone. I had a lot of atheist Jewish friends, oddly enough. It took me a long time to find a Jewish person who was not atheist. I was very surprised the first time I met one, because many Jewish folks are raised in very culturally Jewish homes, but they're told, well, these are stories, these are myths, these are ways that we build sense of community, but it's not quite the same thing. So whenever I had an interest in something, I remember when I was very young, I came across a small copy of the Tao Te Ching, and I just took it home and I read it like I read everything else. And very soon I found in my library, very quietly, wasn't told to me, I just found the Tao of Pooh and the Day of Piglet. So if I wanted to learn more, here are some interesting books on the theme, but it was just encouraged, I was just encouraged to keep reading. Same thing with the Bible. And because I read the Bible, as opposed to being given the Bible in a church context, I also found that I knew a lot more about actual scripture very quickly than a lot of my friends in classrooms. And that was fascinating to see and to juggle the fact that a lot of my friends, when they came from religious communities, it was really emphasis on the community. They were learning faith just from being around people who talked about it, as opposed to it being as rigidly focused on text as even they thought, because I would have read those texts. Yeah.
I wonder if this is summed up by you, the sense that you were raised in a household that nurtured a culture rather than a conclusion. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. And it was a little bit more too, because there's one game I highly recommend to all parents. You would vary it probably a little bit older. Maybe I was 7 when I played this game with my father, and there are different versions of it. But my father played, his version of the game was Last Thursdayism. And it's a wonderful concept to teach children. Do you know Last Thursday, or maybe Last Tuesdayism? At some point you tell your child that the universe was created last Thursday. And you ask them to prove it wrong. And they're like, well, I have memories. Obviously, I have memories far beyond Thursday. And then you add, no, the universe was formed in exactly this quantum state. So all of those memories are just part of that quantum state. How do you disprove it? And so you're introducing the concept of falsifiability and the importance of falsifiability by presenting them with a theory that cannot be falsified. And by
this is right. I think I've done this with children.
Yes.
When I've taught them philosophy for children, when I've taught them about Descartes' evil demon thought experiment, which is how do you know you aren't a brain in a vat, or how do you know this isn't a dream? And it's the same principle. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's such a wonderful, and it's all about the spirit of play. It's not gotchaism. And that's something that a lot of adults also unfortunately do, is that they often see children, as a captive audience. I can just entertain them with my wit and wisdom. And that's not the way to be a good free thinking guide, is because you really want to help them to cultivate their own answers. And it's so easy for people to be enamored by the fact that you and I mean, we could probably pop off answers to Aquinas' 5 ways very quickly, because we've had a lot of experience. We can respond to those things, but it requires an extra level of patience and a comfort with the child coming to their own conclusions in their own way that is not easily taught. And so I know Dale also talked about this. Parenting children within a secular context is an amazing privilege. I don't have children myself. I have nephews, and I've loved to be able to see theory of mind develop in them and to help them create that curiosity, and to be comfortable with the idea of they're on their own journey, and just to allow that to be enough. if you
Yeah,
do
so
enough.
I mean, I've mentioned my regular viewers will know maybe what's coming, but I've mentioned this a few times with my own child. I've got twin 11-year-old boys, and when one of my twins was, I don't know, this is probably 5 years ago, probably just learnt about God at school or something.
Right.
And you know, he came back and it's like, what do you think about God, Dad? And I was like, right, I don't believe in God, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't believe in God, because, and I wanted to, my big thing is I want you to come to your own conclusion rather than believe what I believe just because I believe it. Anyway,
Yeah.
before I'd even finished the sentence, he'd said, no, Dad, but I want to believe what you believe.
Yeah.
So, you know, what do you believe? And I was like, oh, this blew my mind, which is like, this is exactly what I don't want. And why is
Right.
this? And then you start thinking about evolutionary psychology. It's like,
Yes.
he wants to believe what his elders believe because it's a shortcut to maybe like some kind of truth, which is like, if my elder tells me that that berry is poisonous,
Yeah.
then it's easier for me to believe him or her rather than to eat the berry and try it myself. So we get this idea that's passed on perhaps through generations and over eons that, you know what, we believe our elders because it's pretty useful to do so. But of course, when it comes to like things that aren't quite about life and death in terms of eating berries, we come across a problem, which is, the world is flat. I'm going to believe that because you believe that. It's like, no,
Right.
don't.
I'm sure you know the black box experiment, but I always recommend people to look up the black box experiment. Are you familiar with that one?
Go for it.
Okay, so this one, terrific. They compared human children and bonobos, our dear, sweet, near cousins, to see what kind of learning model would work for. There was an assumption that maybe there would be some similarities. It turned out there were huge differences, but interesting ones. Somebody put a box, black box, you can't see what's inside it, on a table, and they show the children, human children first, all these different things you have to do in order to get a treat at the end. And so then the children replicate every single gesture and get the treat at the end. Same thing with the bonobos, do all of the fancy moves, and then the little banana chip pops out.
Yeah.
Do you remember this one now?
Yeah, he's coming back. Yeah, carry on.
So that's the black box where you can't see the mechanisms of what actually allows the treat to come up. Then you move over to a transparent box. And then it's very clear that only some of the choices that are made by the adult actually have an impact on receiving the award, or the reward at the end. And so what happens? The bonobos are like, oh, very clearly, I don't need to do all these things to get the banana chip. And so they do only what's necessary. But the human children, even when they see that only certain parts of that process are necessary, repeat the ritual. So obviously, this is a huge part of our acculturation as our species. It's allowed us to develop and sustain knowledge. It's useful and it's coherently useful. It's just not necessarily going to create critical thinking.
So when I gave a presentation to the University of the U3A, University of Third Age, which is for like people who get old, basically, and give up working and whatnot, but they still want to do all these courses. You can do art courses, whatever.
Yes.
Anyway. I gave a presentation to a whole group, all these different groups of U3A people, and it was about what it means to be human. So I gave a presentation on personhood. Then there was someone who gave a psychologist, a primatologist, who brought that up, and that's when I remembered.
Fantastic, excellent.
She like talked a lot about that. So you know what makes humans human. You know, talk about that. And then there was a guy doing sort of artificial intelligence, and we had breakout sessions. Absolutely fantastic, brilliant. Anyway, that's random.
It's connected.
So you were brought up in a free thinking household.
Yes.
When did you start taking this on in a serious way?
Oh, well, first and foremost, I thought in living in Toronto that I had seen all kinds, because you grow up in a city that seems to have everything. But when I went to university, I went to a smaller city, Kitchener-Waterloo, which had
one of my best mates went to Waterloo. From the UK, spent a year there from the UK. Anyway.
Now, that is a fascinating town and university, because the university focuses so much on software engineering, computer engineering. I was there for different things, but there's also a strong focus on quantum computing, and there's a lot of focus on the big questions, big, abstract, fantastic intellectual community in small hubs, surrounded by a lot of rural communities. So the rural feeder communities brought people to my university who were also quite capable in terms of the technical components, but they were my first experience with biblical literalists credulous biblical literalists, and also folks sometimes who had never seen a non-white person, really hadn't gone to, they had no cultural diversity. So I come from Toronto. I'm used to hearing 6 different languages on the bus. I have seen the world. I have seen this wonderful medley of cultural backgrounds and religious backgrounds and the fantastic coexistence that is possible 100%. And I've moved into a space with a wide range of a completely new species of human being to me. And that was fascinating. And I was popped in for some reason. They give you forms to decide your placement. For some reason, I was popped into the United Church residence, so the lightest of the church residences. And there I was suddenly the atheist. And suddenly the game name was given to me. And it had never been as much of an issue. I had learned about all these faiths, but I'd never been given and forced into that kind of position before. It was fascinating.
Wow. So then you had this kind of label forced upon you, which you then, wore progressively, I presume, with more and more layers, maybe.
With a lot of fascination, because again, these were literal biblical thinkers. And first, it was really difficult to grasp the idea. They exist in Canada. We have our own little Bible Belt. We do. We absolutely do. And so I encountered quite a bit of the Canadian Bible Belt there. And it was fascinating because many of them had never thought, truly, they were growing up in evangelical worlds that gave them a lot of confidence. They were maybe going to go off on a mission and they were going to bring Jesus to Africa. And I would ask them just gentle questions. So like, if you don't go to Africa and those folks never learn about Christ, then is your God going to send them to hell? And they're just the horror. They'd never thought about these things before because they had grown up in a completely different momentum. So it was for both of us, for everyone in that community. It was quite fascinating on both sides. I wasn't the only atheist in the dorm, but definitely I was one of the most openly curious about, really?
It reminds me, as you said that, I went to see Book of Mormon the other week.
Fantastic.
Which is exactly that, which is, let's go to Africa and change everyone's lives. And then
right.
Absolutely brilliant.
But it was the funny thing is that it was out of curiosity to truly, I wanted to understand the mind and the background because I had heard about these kinds of people and communities in the United States, and it made sense because the United States had a different context. But truly, I hadn't quite expected it to emerge in Canada. So I had a lot to learn about the range, the full diversity.
Yeah. So you came into contact with people who believed antithetically to you, and I'm guessing that you built up your defensive capabilities for your own worldview, whilst also experiencing people with wildly different worldviews to yourself?
On both sides, because something else was also happening. I was also encountering my first deconverted people. And so I hadn't encountered deconverts before. And I found was fascinating, those particular atheists. Now, I grew up, again, absorbing the reading, but I knew Dawkins through extended phenotype. I wasn't reading him through the books that a lot of deconverted Christians would be reading him. And Christopher Hitchens, I loved his articles and his analysis of literature, not God is not great. Because I wasn't a deconvert, I was engaging with these materials and these conversations from a different way. And suddenly I found a lot of folks who were going through the first throes of freedom from that particular belief set, and they were replicating so many of the mannerisms of their faith without realizing they were still doing it.
So I've said this many times before, which is when you have an evangelical Christian who does a really quick deconversion.
Yes.
They often do a 180 spin the other way, but they maintain their same kind of certainty and evangelical attitudes. So that those people become militant atheists.
Yes.
Rather than someone who goes through a slow nudging deconversion that then becomes arguably a healthier kind of atheist, psychologically speaking, maybe. I don't know. But yeah,
it's certainly interesting. So again, I was still studying. I felt I was in the middle of an ongoing cultural anthropological experiment because I was seeing a lot of folks who in this particular extreme religious community in their background, as well as a kind of atheist who's atheist like me, but not at all like me. And so there was a sense of how do you negotiate the spectrum of secularity. And we, of course, the conversations for that at that time were fairly limited. New atheism also, there were basic human behavioral problems with new atheism because a lot of the four horsemen were shot up so quickly into fame based on certain elements of expertise, but then suddenly everybody wanted their thoughts and opinions on a wide range of things. And so you'd have Sam Harris waxing poetic about things that Sam Harris is not an expert on, and then having a lot of difficulty ceding his views to experts, as one would try to do as an empirical thinker and rationalist. But I don't say that to castigate anybody, because it's that system of pedestals that creates this problem. You have people who are shot up into fame, and human beings suddenly have this huge following who are asking them, please tell me what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on that? Stephen Hawking as well was asked about aliens. That's not his area of expertise. Why on earth ask him about what we're going to do with first contact? That is not in his wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It is a cultural problem writ large. And the recent deconverts that you're talking about are one manifestation of it. So it really was a completely different world, different playing field, but it was also a lot more binary than the one that I grew up with in Toronto. Because the one in Toronto definitely accords better with my sense of humanism. And I say humanism now without the secular component, because the project of optimizing and maximizing human agency and of drawing upon the most comprehensive data set to do that requires looking at far more fields of science than a lot of traditional, especially freshly deconverted atheists will look at. So they'll often look only at geology, or they'll look at cosmology, or they'll look at biology, evolutionary biology, but they won't think about behavioral sciences, and they won't think about a lot of the social sciences and the data from those fields that should also inform how we debate, how we choose to debate, when we choose to engage. So there was a narrowness and a rigidness from one field of atheism that I knew was not right for me, and yet there was not yet a broad enough discourse because of the prominence of new atheism at that time to create space for all these different secularities.
I wonder if that's partly just a natural byproduct of it being a very young movement in terms of American discourse, you know, the public atheism of the sort that you're talking about. You know, atheism has been around for obviously for much longer, and the humanism as well. But the idea that very publicly you can say, I don't believe in God, and this whole thing was a relatively new thing. And with a new worldview like that, if you can call it a worldview, you know, you're going to have teething problems. And I guess, you know, there's a lot of pushback.
The debate circuit, because again, this was all in an area of digital media. So suddenly people had access. Oh, if you want to watch a debate, you can suddenly watch a debate, and of course, buy the book that comes after it. It's funny, though, that it also happened alongside, in many ways, 9/11. And this was really important for, I think, also the downfall of a certain way of thinking about new atheist debate. Because I remember one of the debates that pretty much ended my interest in the debate circuit was Ken Ham and Bill Nye. And at that moment, I found, no, we can't continue to create these false binaries and establish these kinds of platforms as equivalent. At the same time, 9/11 deniers and many other conspiracy theories were also employing the same model that was so useful for new atheism. So I could also see, this is actually quite destructive for a culture in a much broader sense if we present and normalize this kind of debate, the idea of everything being on a level playing field, every idea being a matter of one side versus the other 50-50, that creates the culture of conspiracy theories that we have. So it's quite toxic.
Famously exemplified in the climate science debate. So the BBC had to go through a whole process of working out how to, as a national broadcaster here in a very important place in a lot of our lives, but used to give like 5 minutes to the climate skeptic and 5 minutes to the climate scientist. You're like, hang on,
exactly.
98% or whatever it is, 97% of people, scientists, like believe in this, and it has that much more credibility. Why are you giving everyone 50-50? So they've had to go through a process of understanding how to present things that are imbalanced in terms of academic, you know, foundation, in a way that still you can give a plurality of voices, but give that in a way that's properly weighted. And, you know, but debates don't do that. It's like oxygen to both sides equally.
Yeah, and I think the other problem is, I know I was enamored by a lot of these too. Who wouldn't want to be able to speak with the eloquence of Christopher Hitchens? Like, there was a sense of, I want to be able to do this. And of course, I was well read, I was informed, and so there was a lot of practicing the same kind of speech styles, which plays into the need for behavioral sciences to recognize that having the best argument does not intrinsically mean that you're going to change minds. And unfortunately, the United States has had to see this in electoral cycles, because obviously a very anti-intellectual way of building trending terminology around elections, where if somebody can just put a name like Sleepy Joe, that's it. That name exists, and it has nothing to do with what we consider to be rational debate. It has nothing to do with coherent argumentation. There is another body of linguistics that a lot of these debates completely ignores, and it's because we're so enamored by it.
Rhetoric, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yes.
going back to Greek times. I mean,
yes.
It turns out I've won every single debate against all the greatest people in the shower.
Yes.
So my favorite meme, right? My all-time favorite meme is a pie chart, which is almost entirely filled, and a tiny sliver says, so the title is, you know, what I do in the shower, and the tiny sliver is clean myself. Yes. And then the massive part is win imaginary arguments against other people. And it's like, yeah, that's what I do. I've beaten William Lane Craig at least 50 times.
Oh my goodness.
That's a fact.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
But there you go. So you got into humanism and then grew into more of a secular humanist adherence, for want of a better term, and you're here now. Well, in fact, let me share with peeps the your page or the about you on OnlySky. So OnlySky is where we both write. It's a platform to represent the non-religious in the world, throughout the world, and obviously in America. But you are not one of the American, and I'm not one of the American writers. And you write on a wide range of topics, which is interesting in and of itself. Do you want to talk us through? Where do we start here? Do you want to talk us through what your interests are in terms of writing articles at OnlySky?
Oh, I'm so thankful for this forum, because I get to focus a lot more on global humanism, which is another term that I have moved into. So secular humanist helps to identify the fact that I am joined by a lot of people from religious backgrounds who are also interested in optimizing and maximizing human agency. But how do we do that? We've talked about the idea of bringing in the world, or maybe just, even when we say bringing in the world, it suggests that we're the one game in town. Global humanism is much more about thinking there are many other conversations in process, some of them good, some of them bad, and it's really important for us to be informed of those conversations in process at the same time. So a lot of my work is to identify for folks and to remind folks, just even if they don't read my articles necessarily, to see at a glance that there are other conversations happening. It is so easy to get caught up in the tempest in a teapot. Sometimes it is a huge tempest inside the teapot of United States discourse. But for instance, my recent series on fascism in India, the next two pieces will be up next week. It's a 4-part series that is addressing 1.4 billion human beings. It's giving people a wee little update, tiniest little updates about something that is affecting a staggering number of human beings that we often don't think about. And yet those people are just as human as the rest of us, just as engaged in questions of wonder and place, and trying to figure out the best social contracts with which to move through the world. And of course, the other interesting part about that 1.4 billion is they're not as caught up in US evangelical Christianity. They have other frameworks that are completely lost from our conversations. So sometimes just to give that little nudge.
They've got their own version of Modi-driven nationalist religious. Yeah, anyway.
Do they ever? Please read parts 1 and 2. Just to the first part in that particular series identifies how important it is that we don't pin everything on Modi, because that's a danger of oversimplification. It's 1.4 billion people, but the way that our media talks about it, because we don't have the background, because we're not informed enough about everyday Indian politics, we end up over essentializing things and saying Modi's India, and that comes up so often.
It's very similar to the Trumpism in America, which was like Trump, but actually Trump was a symptom of a larger malaise in American politics and American culture, arguably, depending on which side of the aisle you want to sit on. So yeah, absolutely. Of course, you know, we're nothing if not good at simplifying.
We're terrific at that. Absolutely. It's nice to have some things we're good at as a species.
Yeah. There's a great documentary filmmaker for anyone who's got time on their hands called Adam. This is my MS. I'm talking about my MS brain. So he's I'll come up.
Oh, Century of the Self. Are you talking about Century of the Self?
No, I'm talking about Bitter Lake, hypernormalization,
Yeah.
and the power of nightmares.
It's Adam Curtis, isn't it? Or maybe I'm
Adam
getting
Curtis. Adam, you are right. Adam Curtis. Thank you,
All right.
Adam Curtis.
There.
So I wasn't aware of that one. So unless it's called something different over there, that his latest one was really
Yes.
interesting set of narrative stories.
Yes.
But those ones, Power of Nightmares and Bitter Lake, hypernormalization, are all about in part about how we simplify really complex narratives at our own, in a very dangerous way. So
yes,
anyway.
Century of the Self is good. It looks at the establishment of PR and how a lot of the ways that we think about the world have been shaped through that for the last century. They're not, we take them now for granted that this is just the way that we interact with the world, but they actually were part of a very Freudian campaign to contrive a way of thinking about the world. So he does emotional historiography. He focuses on histories of emotion and feeling and sentiment, and a wonderfully different way of approaching our history as a species.
He's just, I love the way he uses his own voice and music in just
of course you love the music. Yes,
absolutely wonderful. He's just brilliant.
Yes.
So you have that very global feel to your writing, and you've sort of touched on that. Why? Talk to me a little bit about sort of the importance of the global view in terms of your writing and humanism.
I'm going to answer that by there's a particular response I sometimes get from my articles, and people will say, well, we can't deal with that yet until we deal with the problems at home. And they don't realize that they are connected. And there are so many ways in which the construction of borders, the construction of these info silos, the construction of these isolated communities, let's fix all of our problems internally first, and then we can fix the world, is part of the problem. It's perpetuating that particular issue that causes all of us to suffer more. For instance, living in Colombia, there is a lot of poverty in Colombia. The rich-poor divide is pretty extreme. And yet rich-poor divides, disparity, and the problems of the completely declining and erased middle class are almost universal to the world. And yet most of these groups in individual countries do not realize that they have common cause with many people from other countries. So they think the only way that they can negotiate or talk about this is in response to the specific context in their particular culture. A little bit more information from folks in the United States learning about other parts of the world can also help to empower them to change their policies locally. They can say, oh my goodness, look at the way this other group is responding to these particular issues. Now suddenly I have information and power that I can use. So it's not just about, oh, let's learn about the struggles of many indigenous people in the Amazon so that maybe we can help them from our place of benevolence and greatness. No, yes, exactly. It is to recognize that we are all, whether we realize it or not, engaged in many similar struggles, and that common cause will empower us all.
There's a really good exemplification of what you were just talking about in the interconnectedness idea. So and it's been the same in North America. I don't know about Canada, but certainly America, where we had the whole Brexit thing, which is broadly about immigration, whether people want to accept it or not. And there's this whole thing about the amount of money that we as a nation, as a government, spend on international development. And international development has become this area of government that is absolutely harangued by the right wing. So we shouldn't be sending money to here and there and blah, blah, blah. So, and it's like, hang on, you're just moaning about the number of people that are coming to our country from these other countries over there, right? So we're trying to give money over here to make sure that globally we're kind of a little bit more equalized, precisely so they might want to just stay there rather than come over here. So if you're whinging about spending too much money on international development but want to close the borders so that no immigrants can come in, you don't quite understand what's going on here, and you don't understand how we're all connected, and to solve this problem we might need to do something over here and spend money over there and put effort into other countries to kind of like, because do you know what, if I lived in that war-torn nation over there, I would want to move to Britain or whatever country we might be talking about. So if I want to do that, then it's fair cop for someone trying to do that. So have a better understanding. Sorry, I'm ranting now.
No, you're being very generous, because I was going to say that they do understand, they just don't care. Because you can't have a concept like humanism without also having something to contrast it with. And so I often use the idea of nihilism in a very specific way to contrast. There are folks who actually want to optimize human agency, and there are folks who do not. And you can find them in the secular world where they recognize, this is my one life. I'm just going to do the best for myself. Who cares? It doesn't matter if I win awards for it after, because I'll be dead, I'll be stardust. And then you also have religious nihilists, people who say that anything outside of my specific religious community is meaningless, and therefore it doesn't matter what happens to anyone outside of that framework. And so recognizing that a lot of what we see is extremely short-term choices, people saying, I'm going to get mine, I'm going to do what I need to do to stay in power, to enjoy the fruits of my particular privilege within this context, and then I'll be dead, and then, everyone else will just have to deal with the consequences of my terrible policy. Unfortunately, I feel comes up a lot more often in politics than not just, if they only understood. I do think that many of them don't care,
which is of course compounded by views of the end of the world and rapture. It's
yes.
How much less do I care about the world? How much more nihilistic do I become if I think the world is going to end? And in fact, I want the world to end because I want the new kingdom of God to come, etc., etc., etc.
I remember there was one I can't remember the name of it now, but it was a documentary about certain groups in the United States who go to tour Israel to see the sites of carnage that's going to come. And they're so excited looking out the buses. And there was one lady who, in an interview, was really upset because she said, well, I tell my children that they're not going to be able to live to get married. And they get sad. And I don't understand why they're so sad. It's like you're gleefully telling them that they're not going to have any of the benchmarks that in their community are considered to be necessary for a joyful life. And you're upset with them. You can't even for a moment have empathy and saying, I'm sorry you're going to miss out on that. I promise you there'll be something better, just to see them irritated.
That word, it's that word. So it's a promissory note. It's
right.
Say, look, you've experienced loads of tangibly experienced loads of things that you really like.
Yes.
And therefore you say, I want to do this again going forward. In fact, I want to set up a kind of scenario where I can repeat doing these really cool things.
Yes.
And you're going to say, you're going to give me a promissory note that I haven't experienced and just assert to me that this is going to happen in the future. And I should be happy about it. Well, do you know what? Screw you, mum. Or whatever.
No.
Yes. So you have that global outlook, and is that what drove you? I mean, tell me.
Yes.
What are you doing in Colombia?
Yeah, that's it. No, that's exactly it. And I was at a perfect time in the sense that I had to leave. Very devastating. Anybody here who's had to leave academia knows that it is a loss of an identity. I had to leave when I had my dissertation written twice, but I was not able to go forward to defense because I had the wrong committee. And unfortunately, this is a long conversation. I could have it another time with somebody, but anyone who's been in academia recognizes, oh yeah, that's right. If you get to a certain point in the process and you don't have the right committee, it can just destroy everything, unfortunately. My work was in literary histories of science in the 19th century. I focused on the history of stellar evolution and representations of astronomy. Wonderful stuff. Absolutely loved that material, and it was so important to me. But I also understood sunk cost fallacy, and I was crushed when I had this completed document, labor of love, and a lot of research and a lot of time. And I had to walk away from that identity. And what year was this happening? It was happening in 2016. Was anything else happening of importance in 2016?
A couple of things. Yeah.
Right. So the problem is that at the same time that I was struggling on this individual level, I was seeing how the rhetoric in the United States was also emboldening and empowering xenophobia and racism in Canada. Now, I am 13 generations Canadian. I can trace my roots back to the first white child born in Canada. That's how horrifically white I am. And I, at the same time, automatically always feel anyone who wants to be part of Canada is a Canadian. Done. That's always been the way of it. But that rhetoric was so invasive that I was suddenly seeing my country become just as toxic as many parts of the United States. I was seeing a lot of horrific things come out of that. You have Republicans and Democrats being treated as these giants in the field who can't possibly see eye to eye. And what else is happening at the same time in the world? Colombia is putting together an amazing peace deal. It is putting together a peace deal to bring a kind of closure, not complete closure, but the beginning of a kind of closure to 50 years of civil war between guerrillas and government. Republicans and Democrats can't see eye to eye, but we had guerrillas and victims and government working together to try to create a better world. And I realized in this moment, completely suffused in one particular discourse, that it felt like so much noise to me at that time that was completely occluding my ability to see what other kinds of discourses existed, what other ways of thinking about these problems existed. Colombia is also one of the few countries that has also made tremendous strides in terms of actually empowering the environment as giving it personhood and representation to get reparations within courts. So the Amazon, parts of the Amazon are now seen in certain contexts as having rights of their own. So in terms of environmental justice, completely different.
That's something that really like Brazil could learn from, and Bolsonaro. I mean,
if Bolsonaro wanted to, but I don't think he cares. So that's so we have the idea of there was a huge transformation moment for me. I had to walk away from a certain identity anyway, and it was quite devastating, quite affecting. But at the same time, I felt so closed within a discourse that presented itself as everything that existed. Everything that could exist politically in terms of possibilities for change had to be in North America. Did it? Did it? And when I see these other kinds of conversations happening, I wanted to be able to learn more. And I have been in that process of constantly learning more through immersion here, and I feel much better for it. And I feel I'm in a really special position because I'm so fully immersed with the culture here that I am able to talk a lot more easily to Westerners, even now, who truly don't fully understand that I don't live in a jungle. They don't understand the existence of the rest of the world. But in time, I think there are a lot more of us at OnlySky in particular. We're bringing a lot of different people to bear in the conversation. So hopefully not just me, but quite a few other people can be those translators for change and say, hey, there are other ways of doing things. There are other possible social contracts out there.
So what is it that you're then presently doing in Colombia?
In terms of what am I doing? In terms of writing, translating, in terms of like, how do I live?
Your job, or like what you know, what took you to a bit of personal sort of story for you? What took you to Colombia? You know, what do you do on a daily basis?
On a daily basis, I write in many different fields. So it's writing, it's editing, it's translation. I did teach for the first 2 years here, and so sometimes I will also teach English classes as well. But the majority of my work now does translation. And one of the pieces you scrolled past, recently I translated it's the first time that this particular writer has been in translation in English. He is a local writer, extremely famous in Antioquia, which is the department, which is like a state of Medellin. Everyone learns this person in school. For people of this region, he's their Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But everyone in the rest of the world only knows Garcia Marquez. They do not know the rest of Colombian writers. But Colombia has a rich literary tradition, and I look forward to continuing to translate many other writers from here into Western consciousness.
Brilliant. Yeah. Excellent. So this might or might not have to do with with what we were just talking about. But Shireen says, just a thought, but are we just a species of in-groups and out-groups? Well, I would broadly say yes already. With ethnic ties to ego assigned to social group and not reason to raise social currency. I'm not quite sure what that, I'd have to sit down and think about what that means, Shireen, that second part. But I would certainly agree that we are in groups and out groups with ethnic ties to ego.
I think the way that it's structured, the syntax is interesting, but I think it's assigned to social group and not reason. That's one cluster. And then to raise social currency as the purpose part of that particular sentence.
Right. Yeah.
So in terms of that, absolutely. And this is the funny part, is that we all have such tremendous conviction. I think we were originally going to talk about this, but one of the strongest arguments for atheism for me is the egocentrism of God belief. And the egocentrism, I don't use that word I'm using it in a very technical sense. We have quite a bit of data which illustrates that when people talk about God, they are very strongly talking about their own beliefs.
They're projecting. Yes. Yeah, of course.
Oh. And it's interesting because most folks don't realize, it's fascinating, as a secular person, I have the same kind of neurobiology. So there must be some part of me that could also be convinced, right? My thoughts, my beliefs, my morals are just absolutely right. There's probably some core inside me that could say, I feel that this is right. In every core of my being, this is absolutely the correct moral action. I just don't ascribe a name to it. It's like, oh yes, this is absolutely what God would want me to do. There's that one little bit of vocabulary that's different between us. But I do feel that a lot of secular people are also able to fall into this strength of conviction just as much as the egocentrism that you see in God beliefs.
That's an interesting idea, right? So when a Christian says, for example, when a Christian says you should believe this because basically because I believe this, so therefore, as everyone does, like if I'm right, of course I think I'm right.
Yes,
so therefore, if I think I'm right and you don't think that, then you're wrong. So therefore, it's upon me to change your mind, right?
Yes.
And in the same way that if I believe in my political views or atheistic views or humanistic views, then I'm going to convince you that you're wrong if you don't believe them. So I get that. But what Christians, for example, do as well, as you say, is project themselves onto a God. So their version of God is a moral ideal of who they are, right? Which is interesting. There's so much you can say about that in terms of people who believe in the Old Testament God versus people who believe in the New Testament God, and how that affects their morality and politics and blah blah blah, or how the politics affects that version of God they believe in, or whatever. So sorry, I'm going off on too many rabbit holes. But so we and Christians will try and convince other people by being very, you know, you should think like me. But how does that welcome Colombia into our ears, everybody?
Yeah, very much so. Emergencies everywhere.
but where? So where is our projection? In the same way that the theists will project themselves onto God.
Right. So this is it's not gonna be a direct analog, because I'm not gonna say this is exactly the same.
We don't believe in a God, right? So they can't.
Exactly. Right? But often we make the same mistake when we say things like just follow the science, stupid, or it's science, stupid, or on the internet it'll be like it's science, bitches. We have the way of anthropomorphizing, even though we don't mean to. We'll use that term science in a way that completely evades what science actually is. And science is two things. It is first a process, and the process is. By the way,
we've just segued perfectly into where we were going anyway.
Exactly.
Carry on.
Oh, but this is one of my articles recently. I was talking about the problems with scientific journalism, and I love that a lot of folks also brought their bugbears to bear to this conversation, because quite a lot of us are frustrated with how impoverished our scientific literacy is. And it's one thing to be very frustrated by people who are COVID deniers or they're anti-vax, but the problem is, if you do look at a lot of mainstream media, it does not represent science in a way that demonstrates that science is a process. And so we often use that same kind of authority, and we lean on the idea like it's obvious, it's science. If you just read science, you'll obviously believe the same thing. Which science? By whom? When? What did it have replication studies? What were its parameters? Can I take a look at its methodologies? And so when we do it so easily, because again, coming right back to the beginning, atheist is often used as this sort of a catch-all term, and it leads us so quickly to assume, well, I'm an atheist, I must automatically be a better thinker. And then we fall into those same kinds of fallacies that we would criticize somebody else for very easily. So when we talk about science, we have to be extremely careful. We have to recognize we have one part of it is a body of information and a body of models that currently best reflects the information that we have, and those can change. And it's lovely and exciting when they do change, not just for the scientist who's going to get lots more grant funding if it turns out that their fantastic new idea upturns an entire field, but also for the rest of us. We're constantly growing, we're constantly revising. And on the other hand, that process, as we saw, most people during COVID did not fully understand, and they were not well educated in the fact that as information is unfolding, we're going to have many different interpretations of data, and that's normal. We're going to have one study that says one thing and another study that says something, and we're going to need to wait for the meta-analysis, but we just don't have it.
That's the key. It's we need to wait. I mean, there were things coming out just recently about how the vaccines were actually a little bit more dangerous than they initially thought they were. And there's new stats that come out today. I haven't actually looked at them, saying the real global death figures for COVID.
Yes.
So the idea is that we need to be patient is actually really important. Talking about COVID, and VA, who is a great supporter of this channel, thank you, VA. Really appreciate that. I discovered the atheist movement on YouTube during COVID. Where have you been? You discovered that just in COVID?
Welcome. No judgment. My goodness, we're all on our own journeys here. This is fantastic.
Are you 16, VA? I mean, no, I'm joking.
Maybe, and then congratulations.
Yeah, I'm obviously joking. No,
we're joshing.
VA is a legend. So much energy is spent on proving Christians wrong. That's a really interesting point, worthy of dwelling on.
Yes.
Because actually, I spend such a huge amount of time trying to prove Christians wrong, and or whatever. Or people who are wrong, and sometimes I wonder why I'm doing it, and so I try and unpick my own psychology, and actually largely it's just because I enjoy it. So there is a lot to be said about like striving to make the world a better place, because a more accurate understanding of reality is better for the world, and that is also a component. And there are loads of these more noble ideas that definitely drive me. But also, I just really enjoy this kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, completely. I find I resonate very much with this comment. Thank you so much for it, vaguely agnostic. One of the biggest problems, and I think even as we enjoy it, we have to remember we are still feeding the fire because we constantly center our discourse around Christianity, which means we continue to give it power. And my favorite analogy for this, if anybody is nice and old like us and remembers the TV series Merlin with Sam Neill.
Yeah, Merlin with Sam Neill.
Mm.
We watched Merlin about Merlin, the wizard Merlin, the BBC, the BBC one.
We're not talking about documentaries now. We're going into fantasy. We're going into Merlin.
Well, no, because I'm in the middle of watching that with my boys, but it's not got Sam Neill in.
Oh no, it's not. Yeah, Sam Neill.
It's got Anthony Michael Head as.
Oh, you're watching the newest one. No, this is the 90s.
Oh right,
so
sorry.
I forgot there's a new one. My goodness.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
No, Sam Neill in this one. This one's wonderful because at the end, I remember watching this and being very much impressed upon by this scene. Queen Mab has caused so much destruction in the world. And at the end of a terrible era, she still thinks that if she can just hook Merlin into her games again, then she'll have another chance. And so she does everything to get Sam Neill's attention, Merlin's attention. Merlin is standing with the people, and he says, "Your power is done. Go join your sister in the lake. We forget you, Queen Mab." And then they all turn from her and walk away to something else while she's shrieking. She's trying to get somebody's attention. She just wants to engage them in argument because that's where her value lies. And so I understand completely. It is a thrill to be able to trounce someone in argument. We just also have to remember that when we do that, every time we do that, we are also feeding the other side in the sense that we are feeding the circuit of a specific kind of religious belief that wants power and sees this as a way of maintaining power. So we just have to balance those two, our delightful egotism, which is part of our humanity, it's a part of who we are, and the fact that every time we engage in this, we do also, unfortunately, give power to a side that's quite toxic.
Well said. Yeah. And this is referring back to what we said before, Mitch, again, legendary, well, not legendary, he's tangible and exists. But a fantastic supporter of the channel as well. Thank you so much. In the spirit of conversation, may science bless you both. This going back to what you're talking about, which is the anthropomorphism involved in creating science as like an agent, as a thing, as our god.
Yes, go with science. Absolutely. So it's unfortunate. We're talking about this. The idea is that human beings, we do have to simplify to some extent. In order to move through the world, there's a body of knowledge. Our brains, we're at a very odd cusp in our development as a species. Development is a cautious word because that suggests a kind of teleological endgame. But where we are right now is such that we can see a lot more than at any other time, perhaps in human history.
Journey is probably a better word.
Journey is a good. I like that. Our species' journey. And yet, even though we can see and absorb all of this information and all this nuance out there, we still have to operate within finite bodies with finite amount of time in the day and a set of tasks on a local level. And we just don't have that. Maybe we'll get there when we join the singularity. Maybe when we're all uploaded, we'll have the capacity to fully process the nuance necessary in every conversation. But until then, we are going to oversimplify. We just need to be very careful and cognizant of when we are doing it and the consequences it has.
Do you know what? If I could invent anything, it would be a machine that allows me to sleep for 10 minutes, and that's my whole night's sleep. So then I could have even more time. It's Judge Dredd they have this in.
Absolutely.
That's what I'd do. Yeah. Job done. Thank you, Mitch. May science bless you, or at least the process of science, or something. I don't know, but may you be blessed. I don't even know what blessed means, but have a good one, mate. Thank you.
Yeah. Cheers.
So science. You have an expertise in science, a background in science literature and.
We talk about the idea of literary histories of science. Literature is very important because we have rigid categories framed for us by Amazon, mostly, and many of our bookstores, especially in the United States. I'm not sure what it's like in bookstores in the UK. Here in Colombia, we don't have as much genreification of fiction. It's just all by author name, and you don't really have that many sections divided the way that you do. It's all part of the corporate world in the United States that everything needs to be put into categories and blocks. But literature is a much broader term, especially even going back to the 19th century. So what I would look at is nonfiction text, fiction text, homiletic text, a wide range of work that was building narrative around scientific concepts. And stellar evolution is fascinating because this is a debate that's happening before
What is
Darwin.
stellar evolution? What's
Right.
stellar evolution?
So stellar evolution is the idea that stars actually are created, they have life cycles. And this was a very difficult concept for people before we talk about biological evolution on Earth. Another key debate in the history of scientific understanding was coming to terms with what it means to live in a cosmos that is in process. This is something that was antithetical to certain formations of Christianity, because the idea was, yes, here on earth we have fallen, here on earth we have sinned, and that's why we have all the suffering. But whatever we see out in the great cosmos shouldn't have been affected by our actions here. That should be perfect creation waiting for us. And many people have fascinating ideas about this. I also like to differentiate between the two, because a lot of people don't realize it wasn't as if everyone before the 20th century and the 21st century was all religious. There were a tremendous number of deists. Deism was extremely common. And even if you were religious, that didn't mean you were antithetical to learning about the world and didn't have curiosity. Average people, whether they went to church every week, were also really interested. The way are we today? When we listen to CNN or some other news broadcast that says this just in, red wine's actually good for you and chocolate will save your life. And then, yeah, exactly. We're so excited we share that information. Ah, great. There you go. People 100, 200 years ago also keen and eager to learn. And we know this because there was a book that came out in 1844, Vestiges of the, Vestiges is the short name, Vestiges of the Origin of Creation. The rest of the name is called blanking in a moment, Vestiges, by Thomas Chambers, who happened to be a deistic reverend, but he was anonymous when he first published it. And what he did is he said, okay, we have all this cool knowledge from so many different fields. Let's put it together and let's show people what we're learning in all of these different scientific fields. And it was a hit. People loved it. And it caused the clergy a lot of concern because average people didn't care. They're like, oh, cool. The universe is really old. Probably there are aliens in it. We probably have aliens on the moon, or maybe there's some people on the sun. Even William Herschel, who was the first one to identify Uranus, thought that there were possibly people on the sun. That's how recent our understanding of the cosmos as a much more desolate place is. People were much more optimistic. Oh, it's an old world? Great. I'm sure there are lots of cool new things for us to find in our time in the great beyond. People were able to handle this. Clergy, not so much. Institutions of knowledge, not so much.
This is a completely irreverent aside, but I love the way that you said Uranus instead of Uranus, because that's what a teacher does, isn't it? A teacher, like I've been in this situation with children where I'm like, yeah, and this planet is Uranus, and it's like,
that's right.
No, we know it's Uranus. And then I saw, this is so puerile. I saw a brilliant meme the other day, which is, do you know what? They're talking about size and measurements, and said you can fit 63 Earths into Uranus. 64 of you relax. And I was just like, that's a good gag. I like it. That's a good gag. Anyway,
great.
sorry.
No, completely. I don't know if Herschel, I wonder what his thoughts would have been on that if he had known what he had done. But that's, but regardless, yes, I was going to get to, go ahead.
Well, no, carry on, because I've now made myself forget with
Okay, we'll get back to that. But I just want to I want to set the context, which is that average people are interested in learning. That's the really important takeaway. At the same time, however, something fascinating was happening. A lot of knowledge was isolated in different European communities because we have different languages. So we had two versions of something called the nebular hypothesis. And I should also mention that just before then, Erasmus Darwin had written a wonderful poem about the botanical garden of the universe, where he also started to scare people a little bit by suggesting that, the universe is like a garden. Things grow, they bloom, they decay. And already people were a little bit nervous about this idea of decay. What do you mean decay? Nothing should decay in the rest of God's great creation. So you had a lot of people already a little bit skittish just before the 1800s. And then what happened was, one of the nebular hypotheses was focused on our solar system. It was focused on what possibly created our solar system. How did our sun come to be? And it was often French, so it wasn't inside the English discourse yet. The English discourse had another version of the nebular hypothesis, which dealt with all the other stuff in the skies. Whatever's happening with them, maybe it decays, but it's not affecting us. We're our own system. Then somebody had the gall to go and translate one of the nebular hypotheses into English. And then suddenly you have a lot more people who are reading, wait a second, maybe what's happening out there is also a part of the history of our solar system. And that caused some problems. And people got very anxious about the nebular hypothesis. And when I say people, I mean a lot of Christian leaning scientific philosophers. And then you also had the clergy as well. And they were looking for any proof possible that nebula do not become stars, that nebula couldn't possibly become stars, that there's no way that these kinds of gas formations are part or could be part of a life cycle of a star, because if they were, then they would confirm this idea that everything evolves inside of our system and that it's not connected to human fall as depicted in the Bible. So all of these kinds of things were happening, and in some really fascinating ways. In the early 1850s, there was something called the Wool-Brewster debate, which was terrific. It was an argument over whether there's pluralism is the name of the concept, whether there's life on other planets. And Brewster was confident that, God's obviously built all these planets. Both of them were Christian in their framework. God's obviously built these planets, but for us, when we die, maybe we'll go over there. Or, the planet already has so many people in it. Maybe it's for spillover. And so all these conversations are happening about the cosmos long before we've got satellites, long before we're putting a man on the moon. And it's fascinating to see these conversations happen without any ability to do empirical confirmation yet. And so concerns about the stars for William Whewell, he needed very much to believe that it was essentially just a kind of wash, just a canvas out there, that there really wasn't anything changing. It was all static. It was dropped there. A strong belief was in spontaneous creation of the stars, spontaneous creation of everything, a single body there. And so these heated debates happened while there was still contention about the actual science. And then in 1859, magical year, because we know something else happened in that year, we have the publication of Origin of Species. We also have the development of a tool in spectroscopy that allows us to actually start to assess the chemical composition of all of those things we see out there. And overnight, that anxiety has to go away, because now we suddenly have data. And yes, now we know that our sun is like all the other stars out there. And that changes everything because the data arrives.
It's like every step towards a greater understanding of what's out there is a step away from geocentrism. Every step that every bit of data and understanding seems to put us further and further away from the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. And I think so that's a really interesting journey for those people to have been on at that time.
But again, everyday people, they were like, oh, cool, we got a bigger world. That's great. It was only the panic was in the clergy, the scientists, the people who had a lot riding on it in relation to their positions and institutions of knowledge.
Because, of course, when you start talking about like the evolution of, say, the universe or like the journey of the universe, then and you then start finding out that, it's 13.7 billion years old or whatever. Then you're like, you've got to explain that. So I keep talking about this in my videos. Is there any piece of data that you find out about how the world is and works and whatever? Any piece of data, whether it's moral data that 240,000 people died in a tsunami, or whether it's like, we see in this way, or that happens in that way, or the universe is 13.7 billion years old, you then have to explain in light of omni-God, right? So it's like, it's not only that for you and I, hey, the universe is 13.7 billion years old. It's no different from it's 50 billion years old or it's 5 years old or whatever. It's like, that's just how the way it is. And then we can find out why it might be like that in terms of our naturalistic frameworks. But if you believe in omni-God, it's like, well, why would God make it such that this is the case? So why would God make it such that we have to wait that extraordinarily long amount of time for humans as the apex entity to turn up?
So exactly, and that's why there's a lot of anxiety. Again, Erasmus Darwin, he started a lot of this anxiety, and it's fascinating. Again, he did it in a poem because, again, literature was very different. You often had poetry involved in scientific writings before. It was just a good way. Mnemonic devices, much better in poetry than in a lot of other forms. A lot of doctors' textbooks used to be written in those kinds of forms too, because it was much easier for study. And so you do have this delightful poking of the bear, which happens with cosmology, with the idea of stellar evolution. It also, of course, happens with geology. And there was a huge tumult around the same time period. We know this because of the books that Darwin took with him on the Beagle, because they were popular at the time. They were interesting to learn about a different way of looking at the world as maybe not being unknowable. There was we've had someone's going to come up there. But the idea of not necessarily being unknowable, a lot of people used to think that it was impossible to tell any kind of history. There was no coherence to the history of the ground. And as a result, we just had to guess that there were different phases of the earth with different elements. And then to have that transformation happening at the same time, the 19th century was potent. It was filled with this kind of conversation long before Darwin came around.
As Mitch observes, reminds me a bit of Thomas Paine's deism, taking a step to the side from rigid certainty or orthodoxy in order to reckon with the better understanding of the world around him at the time. Is progress. Yeah, it's that step exactly that. You know, that deism allows for a much greater range of data to be acceptable. You know, again, it's like you have to explain all your data in light of your framework. So if your framework is a very particular, the more constraints you add to a framework, the more difficult it is to explain more data.
Yes,
right? So
exactly.
if you've got a really narrow set of constraints, i.e. a particular understanding of Protestant Christianity, right, where you're drilling down and down and down, and you've got this very particular set of axioms, then any new data still has to be explained in that narrower framework. And that's really, really difficult. So if you step out there and say, right, now deism, I can accept loads more stuff. Where, in fact, deism is, for all intents and purposes, atheism, really. So.
Yeah, well, that's just it. And so the deism was extremely popular. When you talk about the idea of the rise of atheism and new movements, we really lose our history. And I think we gain a lot from connecting with it. So the person who wrote Vestiges was a deistic reverend, and he put this line at the end of the book because he gathered all this information, exciting information. Not all of it was accurate, but it was the best knowledge that they had at the time from many different fields. And at the end, he added this gentle comment that, so if there is a plan here by a creator, we just have to assume it lies beyond the veil of nature. And so he creates that space where he acknowledges inside the veil of nature, everything is very clearly moving in one direction. We can still leave a little bit of space beyond the veil of nature, but here's what we know within it. So the conversations that existed then are really important for anyone who wants to do the work of moving secularism forward now, because we cannot pretend that we are the first to come to any of this information. That is completely, if we want to be empirical thinkers, if we want to be informed thinkers, that is antithetical to our journey. We have to connect with the stronger and very long histories of deistic practice and atheistic practice in other generations.
So I've written on this before, which is the idea that, and I'm sure you all have an opinion on this, that you hear this from so many Christians, which is, well, Christianity is responsible for science. You know, that whole kind of classic, and you know, without Christianity, you wouldn't get science. You know, Rodney Stark, Dinesh D'Souza kind of popularized this idea to say that, you know, it's the foundation stone to scientific progress was Christianity, and of course that's bollocks, because the science is a result, or the process of science, of the scientific method is a result of humans being naturally very inquisitive people, you know, wanting to find the answers to things that they don't know, right? So it's not Christianity that allows science, or was a precursor to science. It's humans.
Yes.
You know, what's your view on that?
Oh, I love talking a little bit about Isaac Newton in this regard, because I feel so deeply for every time that I study Christians in my work, or when I was studying Christians in my work of science, I felt deeply for their struggle, because they're human beings and they're trying to manage many different things. And many folks, when they write, especially atheists, unfortunately, when they write about Newton, they want to latch on to Principia and say, look, he did this amazing thing. He's fantastic. He's generated all this. Oh, also, he did this alchemy stuff. And it's really, we're just not going to talk about that. But it's really important to understand that what Newton had done is he had created something that offered almost a contradiction to his faith. He created a mechanical universe. He wrote down on paper, oh, this universe, once set in motion, has rules of physics that will fully explain motion thereafter. And in alchemy, in some of his notes, he wrote he was looking for the thumbprint of God. If he could just get transmutation to work, he could see God's imprint continuing in the fabric of reality. And so you can see that when you have a figure, very strong Christian figure, who helped to develop science, it was at a cost and there was a struggle. in terms of trying to balance the two, the work that he had done that ended up becoming so useful for so many of us thereafter, was something that many of his other projects were working to then undo, because he himself was still trying to grapple with how do I acknowledge and align what I have discovered with everything else that I believe. And he spent his entire life in many different forms working on that, when he wasn't working trying to find counterfeiters ruining the king's coin. He's got a great, fascinating history, but it's important to remember the whole human being. So his Christianity, in some ways, was not at all what generated the work. It actually created a lot of struggle for him with the work that he created.
And it's the nature that Christianity was a default religion of Europe at the time, which then you're talking about as well, like places of education and light. You know, there's so much going on, and you got the correlation fallacy. Is like, well, Christianity and this and that, therefore all of these things are a result of Christianity rather than being correlated.
Well, then we should all thank Islam, because Islam had a lot more going on for it in terms of the medieval period that we actually, even Christians, would call the Dark Ages. So you have to, we can also talk about that on a very personal level. All of our lineages probably had at least one rape in them that caused us to be here today. That doesn't mean I should thank the practice of rape for bringing me to where I am today, or any of us to where we are, or people who come from slave trades, and you shouldn't thank the practice of the slave trade because at least they're in the United States now. The argument doesn't work in any other context.
Absolutely. Interesting analogies.
Frightening analogies. I'm sorry. The history is horrid. And when you have my the genealogy that I do, where I have 13 generations, I can see that babies were having babies. Many of my ancestors were 13, 14 years old when they were having kids, and then having whole huge broods to populate Canada.
Nice. Well, you know, and yeah, it was a good thing, because Canada's such a wonderful place now. So, you know, if it wasn't for that, I mean, that's what you're saying.
Let's talk to some of the indigenous about how they feel about the occupying settlers. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. God, you have to bring in like reality, don't you? So science, right? Because science is God. You know, science.
We've already agreed that. That's one thing we've agreed at today.
It's a foundation stone to our belief systems.
Right.
Because science is God, it's going to come up with all the answers to all our problems. First of all, what are all our problems? And are you pessimistic for the future, or optimistic for the future? And how much, you know, hope do you put in science? You know, considering you pray to science every night.
Every night, you know, twice if I'm feeling really up to it. But no, people are probably going to be quite surprised. I am a pessimist, and it's very important to be a pessimist. I advocate for pessimism. And here's why. Pessimism, again, the articles that I do, the research that I do, I'm looking at the rise of fascism in India right now, the idea of somebody sanctioning the slaughter or encouraging the slaughter of Muslim populations. I have looked into the research into the humanitarian crisis in Palestine, the horrific movements that are happening in many parts of the world that almost nobody else knows about, recently the civil war in Tigray and all of the military that are committing war crimes there, while we're focused on the war crimes that are happening in Ukraine. You can't look at that information and try to gloss over it. You don't. It's not the appropriate way to.
You've got to remember that Ukraine is predominantly white and near Europe.
Yes, exactly.
Europe, so.
Obviously, we've got a scale for these things. So the thing about pessimism, I think a lot of people think that negativity and pessimism is exactly the same. Pessimism allows you to erase expectation, to say that I can't control the outcome. Many different outcomes that I can see in the world today are going to continue. I will die, and there will still be militaries using war crimes like that to get their way. I will die, and there will still be fascism to fight in the world. Many of these issues will not be solvable. But by allowing myself to accept those possibilities, I am no longer as worried about the idea that I can fix everything, that everything should be fixable in my lifetime. I alleviate that stress, and I get to focus on what can I make strides in, what can I try to fix. But often when we talk about optimism, we see campaigns like end racism or end sexism. And if you know anything about human behavior, you know that's a struggle in terms of our tribalism, our in-group behaviors that we are always going to be fighting. So it's extremely important to me that we don't have sort of glib endpoints like that, that we recognize that we are always going to be in struggle like every other generation before us. And when we accept that as a baseline, it actually frees us up to do more in specific spaces. So
there's sorry to just on that point drill down. So pessimism, there's an idea that pessimism and arguably depression is linked to this. Is it has a better grasp of reality, whereas optimism creates a false sense of where we are or where we're going. You know, at least, you know, I think there's data to suggest that you know, pessimism and reality are slightly more closely aligned. But
we just have to remember there's a difference between negativity. Pessimism is a little bit different in the sense if you just say, well, it's never worked before and that's it, you don't do anything, that's useless. But pessimism is saying, recognizing that this is not all going to be fixed. What can I do? So that leads in, it's funny because on OnlySky, Adam Lee and I tend to disagree on many of these accords because he's always keen on, you know, develop more technology, create more technology. And I'm always often saying, we already have the technology. We have the technology. We're here. The future is here for many of our problems. What we don't necessarily have is the political will, in part because we don't fully understand human behavior. And so we're not able to enact a lot of our promise of current technology, current proofs of concept.
Amen, sister. Yeah.
But it's funny to say that as a science fiction writer is sometimes it's a little bit remote. You're supposed to be imagining like when we get to the singularity, we have to work towards the singularity. No, I had a piece for Water Day where I outlined we already have quite a few different technologies that if put into practice right now could help to fix some of the world's water crisis problems. But it's just a matter of implementation on scale.
Yeah, it is exactly. You know, it's that political will. We have the ability. It's just, you know, I could get a bit geeky about. So when you look at
do
when you look at subsidization, so I've had these arguments about fossil fuels in America, and people say, you know, oh look, fossil fuels are so much cheaper and blah blah blah, and you're like, yeah, but do you realize that how many billions of dollars are spent subsidizing the fossil fuel industries? And they're like, okay. And then you say, but it's not just that. You have to understand negative externalities. So in economics, negative externalities are external costs to producing something. So for example, if I want to produce this glass, right, but producing this glass costs causes environmental degradation. The rivers, right? And you say, right, but I don't pay for that. I produce this glass and that river gets screwed up. Oh, well. And then the government have to then go in and clean up that river. And that costs taxpayers. Then that is an external cost to the production of the glass. And this is called a negative externality. And the only way you get around negative externality, so the free market can't deal with negative externalities. No. It literally can't arbitrate for it. So therefore, government regulation is the only way to do that, which is you fine the company or you create rules that you know, if you break them, you get fined or whatever. So the idea is that when you then take into account not just direct subsidization of the fossil fuel industry, but the cost of negative externalities, then the US actually subsidizes the fossil fuel industry something like $629 billion a year, right? And it's like, so how much do they subsidize the renewable energy industry? Well, the square root of bugger all. Okay, so
is that a technical term? Can I find that one in a map?
It's an economics term. You'll have to. If any decent economics dictionary will
perfect.
So the idea is that, like, you know, we've got the ability to solve much of the climate change crisis going on, but we don't have the political will because there are oligarchies and there are cartels and there are industries that have politicians under their paid, you know, power. Sorry, I'm ranting. You take
No, this ties in perfectly because the question then is why humanism? In terms of, we already talked about what's the best argument for atheism, but why humanism? In terms of dealing with comprehensive information, our problems are not so much based on rigid STEM. It now has to deal with the social sciences of engineering change on a political level. And we do have data sets and we do have an understanding of how to move people, but we don't have
just to explain what you're saying. So it doesn't depend on rigid STEM. You mean STEM as in technology, engineering,
science, technology, engineering, and math. Yeah.
Sorry.
So exactly, we do have other data sets that are often forgotten about when we talk about working with data. And when we understand and include the knowledge of behavioral sciences, the knowledge from political science, the knowledge from how we move systems and how we change minds, and we bring that into the equation, we say that's just as vital right now, then yes, we can say science and technology will solve this. But which science? The science right now of people, of humanity, of anthropology, of ethnology. We need to be thinking in those terms if we're going to solve the problems, because we have the technology, but we still are incredibly far from where we need to be. I don't even want to speculate at this point, because I've been reading so recently so many different studies that saying maybe we can reach goals to sort of stave off environmental refugeeism, but I've also seen other studies that say it's far too late. The huge wave of environmental refugeeism is already in progress, and the civil wars and the resource wars that are coming with it are already here. So I'm not going to try to speculate about endpoints. All I do know is that it's not sufficient just to talk about those concrete sciences. We now need to talk very much in human scientific terms.
Yes. Sorry, I've just what you said is so vastly important. It's almost the most important conversation we could have all year. And then I read this, Mitch saying and then Mitch saying, oops, sorry, was wiping down my keyboard, did not realize I was randomly contributing to the conversation. He's now contributed to this conversation as well. So thank you, Mitch. But sorry, that's a random aside. I just enjoyed it. This is huge. So, I mean, there are so many problems, but let's just take the environment. And right. By the environment, there are so many. What we sometimes do is concentrate on climate science, and then we forget biodiversity degradation, and then we forget like all these other elements of the environment that get trumped by climate science. However, those things are also interlinked.
Yes.
So take that as one big problem. How would you solve it? How would you say, what do we need? What's our problem? Because that's not a difficult question to answer.
Well, I will say that right now, the most important thing is education. And I really do mean that, because one person doesn't have the answers, and yet we have quite a different number of spheres that have been working on this problem. And we need to have more people connecting the dots and being translators between the knowledge that has been acquired in those communities. A lot of people are focusing on hyper-regionalism. You might get it through, some of them might be extreme leftists. You might have anarchists talking about it, socialists talking about it. You might also have libertarians talking about it. Sometimes common cause comes from the most amazing different places. A lot of people already looking at the world have been thinking about solutions on a smaller level. And so a lot of them are focusing on heritage farming, for instance, to try to cultivate many different strains that are necessary. We know that we're probably going to lose the banana very soon, unfortunately, because we're already being hit right now.
All about the Cavendish banana.
It's crushing, but many other single strain monocultural industries are needing and relying on small farmers and small communities starting to do that work of cultivating these heritage brands. So sometimes the work really does involve these hyper-localized communities. The one problem with that is they're not sharing the information very well. They're building knowledge, they're building tool sets within their small groups. And right now, more than anything, I do think we need to find some way to build a much broader library of knowledge or translators from those smaller communities, because a lot of the solutions to these issues are happening locally. We need them to happen locally at scale. But it's going to take a lot of cross-pollination and a lot of communication, which is, again, shout out to Counter Social, the idea of having a digital network that can be more international to help share that knowledge that isn't run by corporations, that isn't run by that kind of monopoly, might also be a really huge contributing factor in allowing that information to reach the people in the places that it needs to. So we're in an information gathering stage is my answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's all these, again, we were talking about we oversimplify, and then I asked you, how do we solve this problem?
I'm never going to forget that one. Thanks.
Yeah. But actually, there are so many. Like for me, for example, in the UK and America, actually, the first past the post electoral system means that you have a deeply unrepresentative form of politics.
Canada
I don't know. I think Canada as well. So it turns out that broadly, the only places that still have first past the post are ex-colonial nations of the British Empire. So yeah, well done
Yes,
us.
indeed.
So there, you don't have representative democracy, which means it's very different. Like, I'm disenfranchised. Like, we had local elections today. I might as well have not gone to vote because my vote means jack shit, because the Tories will always get in this area, which means that on first past the post, any other vote that isn't Tory in this area is wasted, is a complete waste. So anyway, so stuff like that then feeds into decision making, that feeds into localization, you know, local representation, and then you start saying, well, how do you break down the power of politicians in the pocket of the big industries? And it's like, well, then you're talking about, like, how do I get better political representation and more accountability? And so all these things are connected. So you're talking about climate change up here, connected to like lobbying over here, which is connected to first past the post or alternative vote and coalition governments. And it's like, oh my goodness, there are so many variables involved in solving any given problem that it can make your brain bleed.
But we can bypass and do already in certain places with hyper-regionalism. So the idea of having small communities coming up with better solutions and working models, and then the issue is just how do you share those working models? We can supplant the current system that we have from working ground up. We might not be able to do it top down until the oligarchs allow us to, until the billionaires allow us to. But like Queen Mab, if we just say we don't actually acknowledge your claim to power over this anymore, we might actually have a better chance of trying to build some of the systems and then share the knowledge that's necessary to help others build their own hyper-regional systems that work better too.
There's a lot to be said from building from the bottom up. So, you know, even in terms of economics, where you talk about trickle down economics, it's like, yeah, brilliant. So let's give a billionaire who's got like more money he can poke a hairy stick at, let's give him a tax break because he needs more money to. It's like, no, it turns out that if you give £1,000 to a billionaire, it's going to go into some offshore account. If you give £1,000 to someone who's on the breadline here, what do? They go and spank it straight away. Is that a problem? No, because that money goes into the local economy, and that will be spanked again.
The local spanking economy, absolutely, very important. You got to pay your spankers, tip your spankers.
I think that's something a bit different, but anyway. But you know, so it's about this bottom up approach, which is a much more healthy way of doing things. And you know, when you talk about like hyper regionalization, and it's not something I particularly thought about before, but then I think about The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. You know, the Netflix film. I don't know if you've seen it, about the guy that created a wind turbine in his local like village, and it's like, it's that kind of enfranchising of people to solve their own problems. And then to share that with the wider community, to say best practice sharing.
Which I'm going to tie back into Cory Doctorow, because he talks a lot about copyright law and a lot of the monopolization pressures on a legal level that have made it so difficult to exchange knowledge, to create open code solutions, open source solutions, and then disseminate them. But especially, there we go. Fantastic. Thank you, Elaine. But especially in a world with access to certain rudimentary technology like 3D printers, for instance, we've already seen amazing things. 3D printers allow people to have access to different prosthetics at different stages in their journey in a way that would have been horrifically costly for a family. A small child is missing a limb, and then they have to wait or use different kinds of supplements. Now, if you have a 3D printer in your small community, in a local shared tool library, for instance, you have the online models, and then you can just build it. And so we just need to have our data back, and we need to have access to information. We need to have control over the flow of information.
It's also good because you can print up a gun and shoot someone. So, you know,
there are always different outcomes. This is the pessimism. The pessimism in saying, you know, I go to a certain particular point and I can't control what happens after. But
sorry, I made myself snort then. So you are pessimistic, but where do you think the world? Again, this is a stupid question that's ridiculously unanswerable.
I'm never going to forgive you for these ones.
Where do you think the world will be in 10 years? No, like, you know, I don't know what I want to ask with this, but what do you think will be the biggest change in the world? Like maybe biggest positive change going forward?
Okay, I'm going to do a silver lining spin, which is that the United States right now is already starting to see the same kinds of internal displacement pressures that a lot of the world has been seeing from environmental refugeeism, which I do think means that we have a body of building sympathy, maybe even empathy for the situation in many other parts of the world as it starts to affect a lot more people closer to home. I do think we are in the middle of a horrific environmental refugee moment. It's just going to rise, and it's going to lead to a lot more of the secondary impacts of displacement, vulnerability, trafficking, civil war, a lot of violence. But the fact that a lot of people in traditionally safe spaces are going to be seeing a lot of that too, I think it's also finally going to mobilize a lot of people who have felt that they could wait this out, that, you know, as long as their area was safe, then they really didn't have to work too much on this. So I think we might see a little bit more mobilization coming from awareness, coming from these problems finally arriving at more people's front doors so that they can build common cause. So that's my bleak silver lining.
But yeah, it's a really interesting silver lining. It's like it's great because people are going to realize the problem because it would have crashed. It's like
pretty much.
So what's your silver lining? Well, it turns out that loads of people are going to realize how important hospitals are. Why? Because they've all been involved in a massive crash where they're like missing their limbs. So the silver lining is hospitals will improve.
Now you see the pessimism. Fantastic. Yeah, it's coming through.
I like what you've done. So what part does a growing... Oops, I've dropped my pen. I can't feel my fingers. That's a problem.
We're just too excited by this.
Yeah, well, yeah. So what part does a growing non-religion play, or growing sense of non-religion, or growing belief in it, or non-belief? What's a growing non-belief? What part does that play in where we're going and how that might be useful?
It can be useful, but it can also be filled with its own perils because, again, human beings haven't intrinsically changed. Well, unfortunately, I think I just finished a piece on Throughline. It was one of the older archive pieces about the rise of astrology and how the rise of astrology always tends to follow precarity. And so we often like to make fun of people who believe in astrology. But if you look at some of the trend lines, you do see that there's a lot more interested in it in periods of tremendous economic precarity, and people want some kind of surety, and they'll take it from anywhere. And so my concern is that inside a rise of openly non-religious people, we will have a kind of philosophical vacuum unless we choose to fill it, which is why it's really important, I think, to talk about humanism and global humanism and normalize a lot of terms for positive action, positive philosophy, because just being non-religious is not enough, just like just being atheist is not enough. So we have possibilities, we have a whole new landscape, but it now needs to be filled with a vocabulary for change.
I was consulted on a book once called The Problem of God, and it was talking about what psychological functions God provided. So if we're living in a post-God society, then we need to understand what God does for us in order to replace it with other more healthy things and more realistic, accurate things. And so, yeah, that's kind of, that speaks to what you're saying there, which is, you know,
we have a moment of great potential. We can change a lot of our stories. We can change a lot of our social contracts, but it does need to be a conscious action. We can't just passively say, oh, good, the non-religious are rising. Done. My work is finished. I walk away.
Well,
praise be science.
Yeah, but you know, you're quite right. But of course, you know, as we get a growing non-religious demographic, that can often hide things as well, because it's not like that everyone's giving up God and going, right, I'm an atheist and therefore a secular humanist. It's like,
I love that your voice there was Muppet. Like, I'm now imagining, why isn't there an atheist Muppet? See, Sesame Street needs better representation on this.
This is it. We need to fight. This is what OnlySky is there for, is representation. We need representation in Muppets.
That's right.
So there's a good point. Never been made before. That growing demographic can hide the idea that actually people might not just be giving up religion and going to atheism, but they might be giving up religion to go to New Age spirituality and some other kind of, maybe it's a very beneficial worldview, like largely speaking, or maybe it's just as problematic in other ways. I don't know. Do you come across in Colombia, in your life, you know, people who aren't religious but are spiritual in other ways?
Oh, quite a few. It's fascinating because the Catholicism here allows for a lot of secondary cultural ideas that are not just tied to Catholicism. This is a Catholic country with a history of colonization. And so there are a lot of ideas of lost tribes, or there are lots of ideas of mystical things just beyond the hills and so forth. So you do get to see
a sort of syncretism, a sort of adapting other religions to Catholicism.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you have in South America, you also have Pachamama with the idea of a strong female spirit, and that's what Virgin Mary fits perfectly onto this. And so there's a lot of blending of these particular concepts, and it's always there. It's also very cute because a lot of people might not realize that there are quite a few atheists in Colombia, just not at their mother's houses. That's essentially it. You're not atheist when you're with mom, because mom will send you up to heaven to talk to Jesus. That's pretty much it. But anywhere else, you get to do whatever you want. And it comes from a culture that's very family focused. Yeah.
So Heather Young Leslie says MLC is right. That's good. I wouldn't have had her on here.
That's very kind.
We thought we'd won the My Body, My Choice debate, and now I can't believe I'm still fighting the Christian-fueled misogynists. Yes, well, that's a whole different can of worms.
Well, it does start with the idea of the cyclicality. If we have a rising non-religious movement, there's the question of why hasn't it yet translated to much more progressive policy that sticks? And so I think that's what, I don't want to put words into Heather's mouth, but there's a sense of, we like to talk about the idea that so much is changing, so much is much more open. Why aren't we yet seeing the actual manifestation? Because, as you say, non-religiosity can still hide a whole host of other very toxic beliefs and other cultural beliefs. And we saw this with new atheism too, to really tie up some of our threads across the board, is that during that 9/11 period, a lot of the horsemen and other prominent new atheist figures went right into the idea of Western imperialism, the idea of a culture war specifically against Islam that aligned perfectly with a lot of Christian views at that same time in terms of global war against terror. And so we often found a lot of those same systems, the same structures being replicated even within atheist circles. You can't automatically assume that just because you're atheist, you have interrogated the systems that built up your culture well enough to decide if they're actually something that's ethical to hold and support.
I don't know. I would say in America, and being American-centric here, I would say that the problem is that there is a really unfair imbalance in terms
100%.
of who holds the power. So
Yeah.
you've got a real religious right that have been better at campaigning, but also just hold the power and gerrymandering. They've done a better job of gerrymandering. So you've got this scenario where you've got certain demographics in America hold disproportionate power. And that is a really tough nut to break, which goes back to my earlier point, which is, how do you solve these problems? Actually, you need to create a more representative political system, which means in America that's like breaking the electoral college. It means
you have to go back and fix Citizens United, but that's a decision that's very difficult to roll back.
But exactly, you can't like undoing these things is almost impossible. And
but the United States, that's why they have these small groups. The problem is they have so many small groups on all sides of the spectrum. So you have far right radicalized groups who have taken their guns and they've started to build their little enclaves, and you have anarchist groups that are building their enclaves, but in a different way, focused on mutual aid. All of these different groups are already focusing on hyper regionalism, because they have already very much lost confidence in the idea of a cohesive United States. So you do have these pockets, and that kind of radicalism and isolation in so many parts of the United States. It's very difficult to see how that's going to play out, but it certainly is not democratic. Yeah.
So as we draw towards our ending, let's take on some more of Mitch's points here. Thank you, Mitch. Touching on the trends of global instability, because we're here to solve global instability, by the way.
That's what I was asked. Yep.
Yeah, that's our remit. I reckon by the 2-hour mark, we will have solved pretty much everything. Climate or otherwise, one offshoot of this is a growing prepper survivalist subculture. That's kind of what you were hinting at there online. There's an awareness. I'm not entirely convinced is good.
Well, that's just it. In the United States, there are so many warning signs in terms of the number of weapons and the grade of weapons that are in very isolated pockets and isolated communities. Prepper and survivalist is very interesting because you will sometimes have some prepper cultures that are very much focused on positive mutual aid, community growing, but then you also have radical preppers who are ready for a war, and they're looking forward to that end times war, which again comes into the idea that you don't need necessarily a Christian end times. A lot of people are looking for a very secular one. It doesn't matter, as long as they get to use their nuclear arms that they have been stockpiling for some time to shoot all the people they've been waiting to shoot for years.
It's what a thing to look forward to. Faith, whatever that really means, seems to be a prerequisite for a Supreme Court seat. If there ever was a place for a shift of values, that might be a great starting place. Again, it goes back to this idea of solving the problems. As so multifarious, it's like, getting a Supreme Court that's representative. It's the fact that it is clearly not represented as Supreme Court, overtly preferential to the religious right, which is not what the state of affairs is in America presently, demographically speaking. And so, how do you solve all these problems? Goodness me.
I'm going to shout out to another episode of NPR Throughline, which talked about the history of the filibuster and unfortunately identified the lack of forethought in terms of some of the United States planners and early developers. When they were having their conversations, dialogue existed. There was 37 people involved, and so the idea is like, it's okay if we knock off certain rules that allow for that kind of filibuster because we're all friends here. We all know each other. I mean, we're not going to get much bigger than this. We're just a few colonies. That lack of anticipation and the inability to prepare for scalability has led to many of these entrenched problems. So, again, some really interesting history. I'm always going to shout out to history and good historiography, because when we connect to these different movements, there is also some calm. Just like looking at the world of our past, we can find a tremendous amount of common cause and wealth of information about different possibilities. And hopefully those will take us forward. Hopefully. So as we now come to the end of our journey together, ML, and solving, I think we've solved everything. There might be a couple of things. I will give everything else to science. Everything else that we haven't solved, I give up to science.
Oh, great Lord. Or Lordess, or whatever it is. So obviously we haven't, the only thing, like the cost of living crisis is a bit of a, we haven't solved that. So, but next time. What's sort of ending thoughts do you have about sort of anything that we talked about tonight? We haven't really talked about your fiction and your writing. How does that fit into what we have talked about?
It's funny because now I'm going to have mentioned Cory Doctorow a third time, and nobody's going to think that I know any other author, but he just happens to be such a perfect blend of the idea. He uses the example that if you tell somebody that they have stage 4 lung cancer because they've been smoking all their life, you still want them to stop smoking. And you need to give them some sort of hope that there is going to be some benefit to stop smoking even at this time. You don't want them to be so fatalist. We ourselves right now, we have been diagnosed as a species with a very figurative version of stage 4 lung cancer. We have a tremendous number of problems. And it's so easy for us to think that acknowledging how awful those problems are means that we need to cede any kind of hope of change. And there's no point in engaging in anything. I want us very much, and oftentimes his fiction, he uses his fiction to do this, is to imagine slightly better futures, to imagine ways out of things. My own work in a very different form, alternative justice and social contract theory, helps us to imagine different ways that we can organize ourselves in our relationships to one another, just to imagine different possibilities. I don't want us to try to leap to say we can fix everything. I want us to leap to thinking we can sit with this knowledge, we can know that the situation is awful. That awfulness doesn't need to be put aside for us to start to imagine any kind of small change that we can do within the confines of our one life. And maybe that is enough if enough of us are willing to do that one. You switch screen there. Okay.
I'm going on from what you're saying. No, carry on.
Oh, perfect. Yes, exactly. So if we're able to do that for ourselves, we give up the stress of trying to fix everything, because again, you and I already have fixed it in these 2 hours, and we allow ourselves the quiet dignity of doing the best that we can with the time that we have, being wonders in the cosmos with this rare, precious, fleeting gift to bear witness to the cosmos that we all share.
So those ideas that you're talking about there, are they the sorts of things you like to talk about in your fiction? Because you do write fiction yourself as as
Yep.
as well as your
So
column?
that's the alternative justices, and social contract theory comes up in my science fiction the same way that I will talk about a lot of different ways of thinking and different ways of navigating problems in my humanist essays. I do see them as two sides of the same coin, and there are many other authors who do that. The idea is just to broaden our imaginative landscape. And again, another book that does this really well, everyone's been talking about it for the last year, is The Dawn of Everything, because that is a perfect work of historiography. It's not supposed to be the be-all and end-all absolute truth for the history of deep time human civilizations. It's just supposed to imagine that other ways of thinking about the formation of society and the consequences of different formation of society are possible. Just to sit with that. Very important. Yeah.
Marvelous. Thank you. You have a on your website mlclark.org a list of your publications and short stories and novelettes and novellas.
I should probably double check to make sure that's up to date.
Yeah, but
we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. But you can find ML Clark at mlclark.org and also at OnlySky. Check out
and at Counter Social.
And sorry,
and at Counter Social.
Yeah, of course.
Very important.
How could I forget?
Yep.
So what do we have? We have Vaguely Agnostic saying, great guests, Jono. Thanks, ML Clark.
Thank you, Vaguely Agnostic.
And of course, Go Pessimism. Interesting talk today with a great guest. Thanks. Thank you, Mick, and thanks for really, really kind. So just before we go, what are your final thoughts you want to leave us with, or what do you want to say, and where can people find you? I've already said that, so
pretty much there's one sign off that I use for pretty much everything, which is be kind to yourselves and seek justice where you can. That's pretty much all I think that we can ask for of ourselves in these very difficult times. So
final one, because you said justice and you said social justice before, and the idea that social justice these days
we're going to take another hour.
This is a right old big one. The idea, like, I could never finish an interview. I just love talking. So the idea that social justice is an insult to people. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, again, like the word science, we have to be very careful. I get very upset whenever we go into to say his name and say her name campaigns. Then we talk about justice for a certain person, a litany of people. We will never get justice for the people who have been killed, for instance, by police violence. We will never get justice for many of the people who die in horrific flights from civil war. Those people are dead. They're gone. Justice will never exist for them. And so when we talk about justice across the board, I think we have to be more careful. There will always be people who like to weaponize the new words of the day. When I was younger, it was PC culture. And so now they've changed it into the idea of woke culture, woke politics. But they will always weaponize those terms. What we can do is control our own use of them for ourselves and remember not to set the bar at something that is unfair. So justice for many of the people who have been gunned down in horrifically unfair circumstances, or who never had a chance because they were fleeing one particular war zone and they never found safe harbor, does not look like actually providing them with a better end. It's gone. It means recognizing and honoring that loss in how we decide to move forward and try to make a better world for the people who are left. So it's how we heal for each other. So I think just like the word science, we have a lot to reclaim already without even thinking about the way it's going to be weaponized by the other side.
Yeah. I like to think I'm woke, deal with it, whatever.
Whereas I will not use that word because that definitely is the property of Black activists. It has a long history,
so
100%.
Really, I was wondering if you pick up on that because, it's got a really interesting history, which is well worth, for anyone that doesn't know the history of the word woke, it is worth looking into. It's quite a fascinating term. Thank you so much for the time that you have devoted to this interview.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that, and I've enjoyed this, and I'm sure there's plenty more that we can milk from the cow of intellectual stimulation. That's
Absolutely.
a weird metaphor. My brain is
Let's leave
just come
everyone
up with.
unsettled. That's the important part. You want to leave them something to walk away with. Wait a second. I was up to the last minute. I was good.
And then he's milking cows of intellectual stimulation. This is wrong. No, but no,
Unless they
thank you.
consent. My goodness.
Yeah, that's oh goodness. Oh, that's an interesting. No, I want to talk about the ethics. Oh no.
Another day.
Yeah, another day. Well, look, hopefully we can do this again. I'm sure we've got a lot to talk about. Thank you so much for those who have supported the channel and this conversation and this interview, both financially but also in the conversation that you've had at the side. Thank you so much. Great interview, and some of the best endings are awkward. Fact, true that. So thanks to everybody. As I always sign off, question everything, particularly yourselves. Thank you to one and all, and thank you to ML. It's been a pleasure. Pleasure was all yours, but also mine.
Cheers.